Hello, today is Wednesday, May 10th, and welcome to episode 334 Fault Lines, the National Security Institute's podcast that gets you quickly up to speed 3 times a week on the national security and foreign policy debates shaking up America. I'm NSI's Deputy Executive Director, Jessica Jones, and today we have kicked out all the dudes, so I'm joined by two of my favorite ladies, our regular NSI Senior Fellow, Morgan Vina, and our special guest and perfectly timed European expert, NSI Senior Fellow, Martha Miller. Why you say perfectly timed? Because today we are talking about the upcoming EU Parliament elections. I know Americans crazy, we're focused on our own, but there is a whole nother election, actually the second largest in the world after India, taking place in about a month. About up to 450 million citizens in the EU across 27 member states will go to the polls between June 6th and 9th to elect more than 700 members of the European Parliament, which is the world's only directly elected transnational assembly. The elections take place every 5 years, and they have the potential to maybe shape the political direction of the EU. Of course, this year's election comes amid crisis on the continent. There's the ongoing conflict in Ukraine, and just a general question about, fundamentally the purpose and the scope of the EU itself. It's a bit complicated, so we're not getting into it. Members are elected from national parties, but once they're in parliament, they actually generally join kind of these transnational political groups. Parliament can play a role in elaborating EU policy, approving their multi-year budget. They can impact things as diverse as migration, rule of law, social policy, environment, security, consumer rights, and the like. This year's ballot is the first since Brexit, and it's being closely watched because a lot of opinion polls are forecasting significant gains on the far right. So Martha, I'm going to turn it first to you. So a lot of polls indicate that up to 9 countries, that radical right parties will finish first in up to 9 countries. Is this a seismic outcome the way that a lot of pundits are calling it, or should we not be as worried about the upcoming election?
So I think we should be concerned about Europe in general. I'm not so sure that we need to be concerned about the uptick in these votes for the EU Parliament. I was looking at concerns particularly raised for support for Ukraine from the EU itself. I actually don't think that is an important piece because the EU only comes in fourth in terms of actual military aid to Ukraine, behind Germany, the US, and Denmark. Denmark itself, one of the smallest European countries, has given more military aid than the EU bloc as a whole. So that, I think, is pretty indicative of the most pressing and near-term concerns. What I have noticed is the uptick in Russian influence operations in the past 6 months in particular. And interestingly, the Czech Republic came out publicly, even naming a particular German member of parliament, or the Bundestag, who received allegedly 25 million euros from an entity called Voice of Europe, a Russian influence operation based in Prague. Also, Prime Minister De Croo from Belgium has also been very public about an investigation into members of the EU Parliament receiving money from Russia. So I think the good news is we have some very important leadership happening, highlighting these influence operations, which is the first step to stopping them.
Okay, so Morgan, you get to use your master's thesis here. So who knew this Fun Friday episode would be perfect? Just this week we were talking about Xi Jinping's visit to Europe, his visits with Macron, very different than his talks probably in Hungary and Serbia. And our discussion focused on the unity of the European bloc when it comes to important things like foreign policy. And we were talking about how disjointed and fractured we saw it when it came to that visit. What do you make of this election, and what do we make about the future of unity in the continent as we move forward with, the issue when it comes to China and the conflict in Ukraine?
So finally, I get to use my master's degree for something.
I think we all feel that way.
Right? So, I mean, first off, the European Parliament doesn't really matter. And I know it's a hot take, but it's the only democratically elected body within the European Union system, and it's also the weakest. It's got 3 roles, right? Debates legislation, accepts and rejects laws, and it makes amendments, right? It can't actually introduce legislation, though. And all laws are negotiated with the Council of Europe and the Commission in this weird, funky process called codecision. That said, as Martha rightly states, like, we should be concerned and we should be paying attention to these elections, because what we are seeing is a shift towards the far right. Amongst many EU member states, there's this populist takeover with this pro-Russian bent to it, right? And I think we are seeing, as Martha noted, a lot of disinformation being flooded into the continent from Russia. It's something that I think has only increased since Russia's war on Ukraine, and really does threaten the unity of the continent. With that said, though, as much as I think the European Union would like to tout its ability to unify together on defense and security, when it really comes down to it, NATO's that body, right? And it should continue to be that body. Our NATO allies, I think, are unified when it comes to combating Russian influence, and particularly helping Ukraine defend its territorial sovereignty. And we should continue down that road and continue to prioritize NATO.
So, we have hundreds of millions of voters. To your point, the message might not come the EU Parliament elections might not matter as much, but the message the average voter is sending to their own national governments and politicians is really important. And the more since we have you, one thing that the EU Parliament can do is its members do vote for the president of the EU, which will be replaced this year. Ursula von der Leyen has been close with President Biden. There's been some tensions, of course, on a number of issues through the last couple of years, but she is running for re-election. So when it comes to, when U.S. presidents ask who do I call when I just want to get Europe's voice, right? It's right now. It should be the president of the EU. What do you make of her re-election chances? What does this? How does President Biden, is he paying attention to this election? Do you think he really cares what's going on this topic?
I think he cares, for sure. I think Ursula von der Leyen I actually think that she'll get reelected. Although I think, obviously, that's just my opinion. I think she's a very savvy politician. She has worked very closely with both the French and German governments. And even though she came from the center-right CDU, she has a good relationship with the current SPD, Green, and FDP government in Germany. And if you look at the number of votes that German members and the French members have, I think ultimately she will prevail. Now, there is some talk of what will happen if the more Eurosceptic group within the EU Parliament aligns with the EPP, which is the kind of more traditional center-right group that is pro-European integration. So on the left, they have said to her essentially, if you go with this, we will not vote for you in the future. But they have supported her in the past, and I think anyone who is in European Parliament and is genuinely concerned about the direction of Europe right now, I think would go with continuity, and someone like von der Leyen is a strong voice for that.
It made me feel a little better as our American populace when I was reading that, unlike predecessors, about 75% of polled could recognize her name and knew that she was the president of the EU, and typically that doesn't happen. So it makes me feel better when you've got the man on the street interviews in the U.S. and they can't name their senator or a Supreme Court justice. So we're really not that out of the loop here in the U.S. That's a wrap. Thanks so much to our special guest Martha for joining today, and to Devlin, Bernie, Keelan Wolf, Claude Jennings, and the rest of the NSI team for their help in producing today's episode. Join us again on Monday for another episode of Fault Lines, the National Security Institute's podcast to get you smart fast on the national security and foreign policy debates shaking up America. We're on YouTube, so if you want to see the non-dude almost matching episode, I'm just the only one not wearing white today, please sure to check out our channel for a video of today's episode. And if you like what you heard or saw, be sure to rate, review, and subscribe.